Right. Welcome to Writing for Implementation. Welcome to the kickstart of April's AToMM. Please forgive the incorrect date. It is currently the 23rd instead of the 22nd of April. With that, we will get started. Okay, come on. There we go. So we all know the courier. So he shows up to pass on creepy little notes from the Dark Brotherhood, inheritances, public service announcements, etc. However, he can show up at some pretty inconvenient times, such as the Battle for Whiterun, or trying to trap Ordovane during the main quest. In my case, I was duking it out with a dragon priest on top of Sheerpoint Mountain, and the courier came up to me and he said, "Hey, there's this lady over in Riften, and she says, come get a kid." Like she's handing it out like some sort of Easter candy. Anyways, in that case, I was subsequently fire blasted halfway across the pale, and my horse died. Lydia survived, but that's just Lydia. In any case, you've probably had a similar experience. You've finished a dungeon crawl, a quest, something, and you get jumped by the courier. Granted, the courier is a helpful mechanic in-game, and in cases like Unearthed from the Dragonborn DLC, he can even add to the quest's writing. But why does the courier exist in the first place? Essentially, why does he work the way that he does? The courier is ultimately a tool used to pass on information that points the player to the next steps they might take. They've been written into the world in a way that makes sense, but can sometimes be annoying or even break immersion. Granted, there is only so much an implementer can do to limit occasions such as these, which is why writers should know about what goes into implementing a quest, a spell, an NPC, so that they can meet the implementer halfway and kind of help things go a little smoother for the player at the end. So, let's go over what this lecture is going to cover. We are going to go over what a writer might want to keep in mind when they're writing in terms of how their end product is going to come to life in the game. This lecture is aimed at writers who don't know much about the creation kit, but hopefully everyone might take a thing or two away from this lecture. We're going to go over what implementation looks like for an implementer as well, so that you know what they're working with. And we're also going to be going over resourcefulness, and by the end of this lecture, if I've done this correctly, you should be able to know where to look if you want to get creative and recognize the limits of the project system you're working on. Alright, so we are also there's going to be 3 parts of the lecture. We're going to go over the first part, which is key questions, a very brief review of the basics of writing, and what other disciplines your writing affects. The second part will be going over what goes into implementing specific kinds of writing, such as quests, NPCs, flavor text, the environment, level design, assets, and effects. And the third part will kind of wrap up. We'll go over some examples from the vanilla game, and we are also going to look at what it means to be creative within the constraints of the creation kit. Like I said, we'll point out some examples, give some tips that helped me when I started out as a writer, and then we'll wrap up with a question section and some acknowledgments for people who helped me write this lecture. All right. And with that, we are off to the races. Before we get started, though, I will keep an eye on the chat. I have about 3 monitors here, so I've got Discord up on one and my writing up on the other. So if you have any questions, I'll try to stop at the end of sections and address those. But for the most part, if they're not immediate, try to keep your questions reserved for the end, and we will have a substantial question section. So, let's go to discipline differences. So to give you an idea of what goes on behind the scenes, a writer's workspace looks something like this. And I would like to give a small disclaimer. Thank you, Pat. I would like to give a small disclaimer that this is a screenshot of a quest from my personal writing portfolio. So, writing leads, Please don't come after me for thinking that I've leaked a project or quest or something like that. This is from my own personal work. So, yes. So, an implementer's workspace is going to look something more like this. So this would be, creating a NPC or something along those lines. And here is a comparative example. So this is from the Bandu Olo tutorial. I've written out what the dialogue tree would look like for a writer, and then what that dialogue would look like within implementing the creation kit. And so when you're writing, when you're doing your writing, any kind of writing at all, really, there are 3 main questions that you want to look at when you want to bring something new into the game, or you want to create something that kind of already exists, or you want to integrate something from somewhere else. So those 3 questions are, 1, is this something that already exists? Meaning, is this something that I can recycle from the base game, or that is common enough that bringing it to life will be easy enough? One example is, say, you want to create an Easter egg or an unmarked location where there's, say, a skeleton with a ring, and maybe that ring is enchanted, and that ring might be unique throughout the entire world space, but maybe it already has an enchantment that exists, say, that boosts restoration cost, or, stamina regeneration, something like that already exists within the game. So your asset is going to be unique to that Easter egg, but it's something that already exists. Your second question is going to be, can I build off something that already exists? Meaning, are there existing assets that only need small to moderate changes to make them unique? So if you're writing a quest and you want to give the player a unique reward at the end, or unique loot, something along those lines, can you maybe recolor something? Can you maybe resize something, scaling them up or down in size? Or maybe you can create a building or a small town that looks unique. Say you've taken the roofs from Riften and put them on the base walls of a building from Whiterun. Could you possibly do something like that? Something that already exists, but you could kind of recycle them to make them new. And your last question is, if you are looking to bring something completely new into your quest, your game, etc., what will it cost to create this from scratch? This would mean you're looking to bring something completely new into the game, and this can be something like a new animation. This can be a visual effect. This can be a 3D object, like a set of armor, or a weapon, something like that, or some kind of audio effect, something along those lines. If you're doing that, keep in mind what that's going to cost in terms of time and effort for whoever is doing the rigging, sculpting, editing, etc. So these are the 3 main questions. I'm going to pause. Does anyone have any questions on the 3 main questions? Checking the chat. No one's typing. Okay, we'll move on. So next we're going to go over the basics real quick. And if you don't know what the creation kit is, real quick, the creation kit is what Bethesda used to create Skyrim and is a separate program from Skyrim. So we use the creation kit to create mods from the ground up. Implementation is the process of making quests playable to extremely simplify it. It is a very complex program, and it is also extremely fickle and a pain in the rear end to use. I myself have dabbled in the creation kit, and it is something of a beast to get to use. So, character limits. 149 for NPC lines, 80 for player character lines. Keep journal entries to 4 lines at the absolute most, and journal updates should be around 1 line. Next, know what you have to work with. Essentially, know your assets and what's available for you to use during your writing process. Assume you're going to be working with the vanilla game. this will make it easier to create whatever it is you're writing, because it is always easier to write something and add it in later and build on what you already have than it is to cut something down and have to rewrite around the loss of whatever it is you've cut. And if you are working on a partner project, get to know that the assets that that project is using to bring that province or that game to life. You don't have to keep a detailed entry or a log on what goes where, but a passing familiarity would help. Essentially, just stick your head in the 3D sculpting channel or the level design channel from time to time. Maybe just kind of browse through the images and say, hey, that's cool. Maybe I can incorporate that in my next, whatever piece of writing that you're doing. Next would be use references. This can mean links to pre-existing vanilla quests or other assets, or even just for inspiration. And you can always ask. No one will be mad at you for double-checking. If there's a style guide or an either guide, you can reference that too. Again, no one's going to be mad at you if you check. All right, so your writing is going to influence different departments. The main department here that we're going to focus on is implementation, as implementers are the ones that bring your quest into the game. Your writing is going to affect more than just implementers, though, so be mindful of that. You write for implementers, you write for level designers, you write for voice actors, and in some cases, animators and scripters. Writers affect different departments, and the same is true in reverse. In some occasions, you will get to request, hey, can this department do this for this quest? Or can this department, can the level designers maybe tweak this location a little bit to better fit with this quest, to make this quest flow a little bit more, to make this quest make a little bit more sense, etc. Remember that creating mods with other people like we do in Beyond Skyrim is a collaboration. And the more we talk to each other, the easier it's going to be to understand the limitations of what we can all do. And a little bit of consideration for your fellow workers will go a long way. I should say volunteers, but, So, second part, we're going to go over our writing forms. So you write for a lot of different things, such as quests, NPCs, and dialogues. For your writing process, for these three things, stick to your style guide, write your draft out first, and then go over it and see what needs changing. And make sure your format is readable. The format is essentially how you and the implementer communicate on how the quest should be put in. You will also have to kill your darlings from time to time, as some things just aren't doable in the creation kit, and we will come back to that a little later. For quests, an implementer is going to look for journal updates, implementation notes, and dialogue, especially repeated dialogue. This is going to vary from project to project, as each project has its own style guide. Make sure your summaries are on lock, because say you've forgotten to put in an asset like a dagger that the player is going to have to use in some sort of ritual sacrifice later on in the quest, and then the implementer gets, halfway through that quest, and that dagger is introduced for the first time, and it's not in the summary. So the implementer is going to have to go back and create this dagger from scratch, and it's just going to create a little bit more back and forth that didn't need to be there in the first place. So always double check your summaries when you're through with your editing process. And then, so for our next part, try to avoid your force greets, as those are a pain in the rear end to implement. Give references if they're necessary so the implementer has an idea of what you're talking about. Say there's an example of something in a miscellaneous objective or quest that you think you can kind of reuse in your writing. So link that quest from UESP or the fandom wiki and say, okay, this is what I mean when I'm talking about the NPC can do this or that, etc. And finally, keep in touch so that the implementer can contact you with questions if need be. I will say, as a sidebar, sometimes force greets are necessary like in the case of a multi-character conversation, usually between two NPCs and the player character. How that usually goes is one NPC will lead the dialogue, and that NPC, number one, will go back and forth between the other NPC and the player character. If you have these situations, try to keep them short. Another tip for avoiding forced greets is try to give your NPC an opening bark specific to their situation, and then have the player initiate dialogue to avoid forced greets. So, our next focus will be on flavor text. So, you will need to specify what kind of flavor text this is, which is kind of, baseline. Is this a book? Is this a journal? Is this a letter or a note? Is there a specific type of font do you want this in? Which is, do you want this to be like a handwritten note versus a journal versus a book that might be printed in the Imperial City and bound and fully published? Where does this text occur in this world? Does it belong in the Bard's College in Solitude, or is this just like a manual for avoiding avoiding cross-troll attacks? Or is this some ancient text rotting away in an ancient Nordic tomb? Where is this book? Where is this flavor text? Where is this, etc.? Pardon me. And does this text unlock or prompt anything? Take, for instance, the book, The Ethereum Wars in the base game. It's actually part of a DLC. I can't remember which one it is. I think it's the Dawnguard DLC that incorporates this one. Anyways, there is a book called The Ethereum Wars. This will prompt the player to investigate a dwarven ruin that I cannot pronounce, and that will start the quest, Lost to the Ages. So, for flavor text, you want to keep it short and to the point, because one page in the writing software that you use, be that Google Docs or Microsoft, we typically try to keep to Google Docs because it's a lot easier to share and edit together. So one page in a writing software is equivalent to about 8 pages in game. There should have been an 8 instead of a 5, so I apologize for that. Alright, next we will be focusing on level design. So, on occasion, you may need to write prompts for level designers. So you can write for population hubs, so cities and towns, villages, things like that, maybe even just a few farms. You can also write for environmental storytelling that Bethesda so loves to do in the form of Easter eggs or unmarked location. My favorite unmarked location is a very small clam farm right on the border between Hashingar and High Rock, and it is very far out of the way, but it's my favorite because I think it's very well put together. Anyways, you will also be writing for ruins sometimes on very rare occasions, and ruins fall under the umbrella of unmarked locations, but they are often bigger and more structurally consistent across the board, which is why they make up their own category. The level design may change over time. Maybe if you kill a Spriggan one week and come back to that same location a week later, the local pond will be all dried up because you've killed off their environmental protector, right? For the most part, you're going to want to leave most of it up to the level designer. You can request specifics. Like I said, you can request, hey, can we maybe tweak this walkway, or maybe add a trap in to maybe make this quest make a little bit more sense. But for the most part, the level designer is going to have it handled with the broad strokes. Provide references if you feel it's necessary. Say there's this really cool waterfall that you think might be a good place to hide treasure behind. If there's a waterfall like that that exists in real life, you can put that in, maybe link it to your quest document, and maybe write a little note like, hey, maybe we could put some treasure behind this waterfall, etc. Even if references will help a little bit, put them in. So for the environment covers things like weather and how it changes, or how the player changes it like they would with the clear skies or the storm call shouts. This also covers any environmental visual effects like clouds in the sky, gale force winds, nighttime aurora borealis, and fog. This isn't limited to exteriors as well. For instance, you can get specific with lighting for interiors, but like with level design, be specific what you think is going to be the most impactful, but don't get upset if the level designer comes back to you and asks for clarification or revision. Bringing the environment into your writing can help to kind of flesh out whatever story you're trying to tell, but at the same time, it can add a lot to what an implementer needs to do to bring that quest or that story to life. Pardon me. So next, we're going to look at assets and effects. So assets are defined as physical items within the world. These are wearables, wieldables, readables, clutter, and assorted MacGuffins. So say the Initiate's Ear from the Dawnguard DLC. That is an assorted MacGuffin. That required a unique 3D sculpting, and then they had to bring it into the game through implementation. Either way, keep in mind that these things have to be realistically written. There usually has to be a precedent in place for you to create an asset, and if you want to create something new, then you'll most likely have to pitch it to project leads if you're working on a project. If you're on your own, Godspeed, then it'll most likely be a lot of trial and error. A safe bet is to reference a list of enchantments currently in use. You can find that list on UESP as well as the fandom wiki. I tend to use the ones on the fandom wiki, and I apologize if you are hearing any background noise right now. I have no idea what that is. My bad. Okay. Anyways, continuing on. Effects. When I mention effects, I mean effects centered around the player. These can be spells, in which case, is this a spell that is concentrated on the player, or does it affect the world around them? And how does that spell work? Consider the same for powers. For spells and powers, consider how the player will access these things. For buffs and debuffs, consider how they will happen, how long they will happen, and what ends them or if they end at all, like a blessing or a disease. Again, it's a good idea to reference what the game already has. Take, for instance, like a disease. You will typically get a disease from a wild animal, or a vampire, or even brain rot from the swinging stars in a trap in an ancient Nordic ruin, which has happened to me once. I had no idea brain rot existed, and then, I have brain rot. So, keep in mind that you're going to need to keep an eye out for what's already been done, and if something that can be done. Buffs and debuffs are also common rewards at the end of the quest, or even a miscellaneous objective. So, thank you for bringing back my sword. Let me show you how to do this one really specific sword maneuver. And then the players increase in skill, and they're one-handed or two-handed, etc. That's something that you can also consider. So, as assets and effects, this section kind of wraps up different types of writing and what you need to keep in mind for implementation purposes. Are there any questions so far on this specific section? What would be an example of an opening bark that you mentioned as an alternative? So an opening bark, going back to quests, that would be something specific to a character situation. So say, basic fetch quest. So an NPC is sent a player on a fetch quest. Instead of the player maybe exiting and then coming back and then being force greeted by that NPC, you can have that NPC ask as almost like an ambient dialogue piece. You can have that NPC ask, have you gotten my staff back yet? And the player can then initiate dialogue, and then the NPC can have an opening bark, and then you can just continue down your dialogue tree. No, I haven't gotten your staff back. Sorry, I can't get your staff back. You're going to have to find someone else. Yes, here's your staff. That sort of thing. Something like climbing in the 7,000 steps. Yeah, something like that. Alright, so we are going to move on if anyone has any other questions. Okay, I think we're good. So, what we've covered so far is what goes into implementation for different forms of writing and what you need to consider outside of crafting a story. Now, we're going to look at some examples of Bethesda being creative and resourceful. Please note the air quotes around those two words for Bethesda reasons. You know what I'm talking about. So, let's look at some examples that get creative. This is Kagrenzel. This is a Dwemer dungeon in the, I want to say, Gerald Mountains. But I'm not entirely sure. You can access it through Eastmarch. Essentially, I'm not going to say all that much about it, but you walk in, because it's a very good dungeon. I like this dungeon. But essentially, you walk in and you see this glowing orb of light hovering above this pedestal. And this orb is not something that's unique to Kagrenzel. This is the visual effect that a player will see if they use a healing spell. So this is something that already existed in-game, and that was recycled to kind of help bring something to life. And there was, theories about what this glowing orb of light is, but, we already know what it is. It is the healing spell light effect. And that's just being resourceful. That's just, it's a good example, essentially. Try to stand as close to the pedestal as you can get when you go into Kagrenzel, and that's all I'm going to say about that. So our next two examples will be a little bit morbid, and our first one, or second one I should say, comes from the Labyrinthian. This is kind of hidden away. It's close to the word wall in the Labyrinthian. But if you look close to right here, close to the skeleton's middle, you will see a smaller skeleton. And from this, we can infer that this skeleton was a woman who was pregnant in the 3rd trimester, and she died, and so did the fetus. Yeah, I know, it's very shocking when you see this for the first time. However, this is an example of scaling something down to help tell a story through the environment. So that is something that is doable. It can be a little tricky, but it can also, it can have a massive emotional impact on the player. The next example is also morbid and also had a very emotional impact on me when I went through it, and it comes from the ancient Nordic ruin of Forelhof. This is a holdout of the dragon cult it's in the Rift, and there is a dragon priest there. So essentially, Forelhof was attacked by the Nordic forces that were trying to overthrow the dragon cult. And the dragon priest, I am spoiling this, I'm sorry, the dragon priest essentially commanded his followers to drink poison. What you're seeing here, this is not a glitch, this is not a mod, this is in the vanilla base game. These are children. These are small Draugr children. And here is a adult Draugr for scale. So once again, they've resized something that already existed to kind of help tell a story. And yes, this is gruesome, but it is also extremely effective. They do so much with so little. They very much do. Our next example is going to be much less gruesome. It is, in fact, one of my favorite parts of the Thieves Guild questline. It's I'm not sure how to pronounce this. It is Icontar's spider and the spider control rod. So what we see here is an already pre-existing Dwemer spider model. What we also have here is a unique 3D sculpting asset that had to be brought into the base game specifically for this. But what happens with these two things, the player can wield this spider control rod and kind of fire on places on the ground and direct the spider there, here and there, and everywhere. Essentially, the thing that directs the spider to those places on the ground looks something along the lines of a destruction lightning rune. It's got the same sort of purple glow. It's got a little bit of shock to it, and it is something that is a little bit more of a reach in terms of creating something completely new, but it is, I think, still a good example. And the Icantor's spider is my favorite little guy in the game, so I would say that that makes it worth it. So, these are some examples. I would like you to start maybe thinking about some other examples that you've noticed in game, and then maybe once we get to the question part, we can maybe go over some of those examples and kind of pick them apart and see how they work. So, next would be just some basic tips for helping you kind of get a hang of what can and can't happen in the creation kit when an implementer or a designer or someone along those lines is bringing your writing to life. So, watch an implementer's live stream or a level designer's or a 3D artist. This can help you get familiar with their workflow and their tools and how they work, and it'll give you an opportunity to learn and ask questions as they come up. So again, the next tip would be familiarity with your unique assets and the base game is going to be a major benefit when it comes to knowing what can and can't be done with the creation kit. Next one, and I did say we would come back to this, kill your darlings, but know where to dig them up. Essentially, if you have an idea that won't work out now, but you think might inspire something else further down the road, or if it needs more time to dedicate to revision and working the kinks out of that idea and you just don't have that time right now, save that idea to another document so that you can come back to it later, kind of like a graveyard. So, it's a little bit of writing necromancy, if you will. And this goes for all types of writing, not just game writing or writing for specifically implementation. This is just a good idea in general if you're writing. Writing necromancy. And the next few tips that I have, double check UESP and the fandom wiki for examples and resources, and that list of enchantments that I was talking about earlier, they have that as well. Use your style guides and support docs, just read those through. You don't have to read those through every single time you go through it. You can glance at it. If it's formatted properly, you'll be able to tell what section you're going to need the most. And if all else fails, just stick your head in the implementation channel and just ask, hey, can this be done? Can an NPC paralyze the player? Can we possibly create a staff that shoots clouds? I don't know. Something along those lines. And before we end, I know we're ending a little early, but I kind of like to give you guys a lot of questions, or time for questions, excuse me. Before we end, I would like to kind of leave off with a metaphor that's going to sound a little strange, which is dancing in a straitjacket. It's a metaphor for writing, and it fits game writing especially well. What dancing in a straitjacket means is that you are going to have to learn to dance with a very strict set of constraints around you, or in this case, you're going to have to learn to write with those constraints. But once you learn how to write, you're going to be the best writer, or you're going to be the best dancer in the ballroom, or the asylum, essentially. Because once you have a knowledge of how to move within those constrictions, you're going to be able to work a lot faster. You're going to be able to You're going to be able to work a lot easier, and you're going to be able to come up with ideas that are actually feasible for you and the rest of your team. So, that's kind of my very strange metaphor. I kind of hope that helps clear something up, and if it causes extra confusion, I apologize for that. And before we wrap up, I would like to give a special thanks to Mike, Hendris, and Dr. Lamont for helping me write this lecture, and to Pat for organizing this AToMM. So, do we have any questions or any examples that you might want to share? So this is something that comes up in nearly every writing discipline, not just in game writing. This is something that they teach to engineering students. This is something that they teach to chemistry students in university, because knowing how to write out and describe instructions or a process is something that is very critical to just plain communication everywhere. So initially you're going to start out going down the road or down the process of how you would do it, and then assume that you have absolutely no base knowledge of how this is going to happen. So the writer, in this case, for game writing, say you want to, going back to the temple example, say you want to add in a section of the temple that would make sense for, say, what a ghost is saying about this temple to the player. Like the ghost says, oh yeah, sorry, I died in this section of the temple, but the temple's already been constructed on the level design side. So you can request that you can either, set a time up for level designers to go through that dungeon and then point out exactly where that corpse should be, or you can help write in prompts for that level design. In other cases, say for you're writing a town or something along those lines, make sure you describe in plain language. Try to use as little jargon as possible for descriptions. Sorry, I just need to grab a drink of water. Yeah, so use as little technical jargon as you can. Keep to the present tense. Keep to very simple, to-the-point things. And then get someone else, if you can, to kind of read through those things, read through those instructions and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. And always assume that your audience doesn't know what you're talking about, because if you know your audience, your writing is going to be a lot more clear. Does that answer any questions?
I have a question. I was very interested about the force greeting. I had not heard that it was more difficult than a normal interaction before, and that could just be me not paying enough attention, to be honest. But why, from an implementation standpoint, is it so much more difficult than a normal interaction?
So, from what I've heard from implementers, force greets are kind of a pain because you're initiating an NPC to interact with the player in a way that initiates a dialogue tree, and that can be tricky. I can't speak to the specific details of that, but it's just something that I've heard from almost every implementer that I've asked when I was writing this lecture, and even before I started writing this lecture, like, try to keep away from the force greets because they're a real pain to implement.
As far as I understand it, it's pretty much so. To implement dialogue, you need to tell the NPC exactly when they need to speak that dialogue. So a quest moves in stages, starts at stage 0, often ends at stage 100, and dialogue is usually is usually keeping track of the current stage that it's at. So a dialogue for a force greet would have to be at, like, you need to mention that, okay, this dialogue right here that's playing for the force greet, that's only for stage 30 or 35. So any other dialogue would need to be conditioned so that it doesn't play during that time as well. At least as far as I understand it.
Yeah, so thank you, Hendris, for that, because I think that was a lot more in-depth than what I could have done. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you, both of you.
All right, I wonder if anyone has any examples like the one I brought up, hopefully ones that aren't as morbid.
I have a few examples. A lot of the Daedric quests in Skyrim reuse a lot of spell effects as the Daedric princes. For example, when you're talking to Meridia, you're actually just talking to a very big mage light effect. The same goes for the Augur of Dunlane, and if you play the Skyrim without the DLCs, Hermes Mora also shows up as a spell effect, specifically Soul Trap, if I remember correctly. And also the Mages College, it reuses a lot of things in a creative way, I think. A lot of the lighting indoors is managed by the little post things where you usually see soul gems on, except it has mage lights. And the midden in the college also uses a lot of skeletons mashed up in really weird and morbid ways, with hands coming off the skulls and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Midden is pretty morbid, but I like it.
Yeah, it is just really weird. There's no explanation as to what it is.
There's I'm sure there's a few lore beards somewhere on Reddit or YouTube that have theories on it.
It's just the basement. That's just all I know about it.
Mm-hmm. Those are some pretty good examples, yes. The College of Winterhold quest line is a little... it could be better, in my opinion, but I think the way that they constructed the physical space is interesting, and I think it could be even more interesting if they had been given a little time for a little bit more spit and polish. But yes, good examples. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can think of an example from Enderall where, like, they have these, like, flying creatures and they just reuse the dragon animations for it.
Ooh,
And
very cool.
It's really effective, yeah.
That's why we have mods to fix Bethesda's weird decisions. Exactly. I think the modding is pretty much the main reason why Skyrim is still playable today. All right.
I have an example, not of a moment in game, but just of something that you said earlier that I would like to stress even further. I'm so glad you brought it up, which is talking to the rest of your team about what is possible with implementation. I'm one of the writing leads on the Valenwood team, and I recently went to our implementation team and said, can you equip non-weapon objects as weapons for NPCs? And if so, can it be child NPCs? And that's not a question I could possibly answer on my own. It's also a question that not only were they able to answer it, they were able to work out new ways of how it might be done that they hadn't considered before. And so even just by asking implementers, is this possible? You may get an answer at first that's like, no, I don't know about that. And then someone will come up with an idea and they'll try new things. Because just like writers, implementers are human and like figuring out stuff. So you can actually get things that you wouldn't have been able to get if you didn't ask. It's much easier to see a document and cross off something as, no, we can't do that, than it is to answer a question and have a dialogue and realize, yeah, maybe we could do that. So it helps in a lot of ways. So thank you for bringing that up, because please, everyone do that when you're on project.
I actually love that example, and I think I'm getting a little bit of feedback. No, okay, it's gone now. So I think there is a mod somewhere out there that lets you use like brooms and forks and shovels as weapons, but creating that for children in the game to use, that's something new. So I think that's another great example of how writers collaborating with implementers, collaborating with level designers, etc., can really help drive, the state of creativity in any project.
Exactly. Yeah. So I would encourage everyone to keep those lines of communications open.
Exactly. So we have about 10 minutes left. Are there any sort of burning questions or funny little anecdotes that you would like to share, perhaps of where a courier has caught you in a bad situation?
Hi. This is more on the creative side of things, but in general, just like when it comes to designing a quest which is not a main quest, like where do you even begin with it?
So if you're writing a side quest, you want to figure out anything from where you're starting to where you're going to end up to, what you want the player to achieve at the very end. This is something that's a little bit more broad, I would guess. Writing side quests is something that is, always fun to do. Sorry, you had an add-on?
No, I was just saying that, yeah, it is a bit too broad. I'm sorry for that, for the vagueness of that question.
Yeah, well, you can maybe bring it into the group workspace after the lectures. I'm going to be there for a little bit, working on some of my own writing, so if you had something specific that you wanted to ask or work on, then yeah, come find me there.
Thank you. And thank you for the session. That was amazing.
Thank you. Any other questions, examples, etc.? All right, well, I think we're all good. Pat, can we maybe take it away?
I have a remark that I wanted to make. Tallis was very articulate about pretending that you don't know anything about the thing you're describing. Describe it as if you were a naive reader, so that you're being very clear and not making any assumptions when the implementer is supposed to be deciphering whatever it was you wrote. And I think that goes also for just general writing. I've, as a teacher, seen several instances where the writer has all kinds of backstory in their head and it doesn't get onto the page. So when you're rereading anything you write, you want to make sure that everything on the page is clear to the reader and there's no prior assumptions required for the reader to understand what you meant. Make sure that it all gets spelled out, even if it feels tedious at first to explain everything. It's probably better to explain more than to assume that the reader will just understand what you meant because you had it in your head. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's... Ooh. I don't think I can. If I did, I would have to spend a decent chunk of time either going through like old technical writing documents that I legally can't share, or current legal writing documents that I also legally can't share. But essentially, yeah, example quest definitely. Even if like you have the ability to annotate a document or suggest a document, those can also help with clarification as well. But essentially, you always want to assume that your audience has absolutely no idea what you're talking about. So providing background in things like a summary up top and then getting into the process of what needs to be described, that's kind of like a staple structure of technical writing. And technical writing is, like, if you don't know anything about technical writing, I would highly suggest getting into it. I'm not going to recommend you any textbooks because those are super boring and very dense, and it took me, 4 years to develop, what my technical writing process looked like. But for the most part, do it procedurally, do it step by step, and if you have kind of like equal steps, go by what's going to be the easiest to do and then kind of progress into what's going to be the hardest to do. Those are kind of some just hips off the top of my head when it comes to technical writing. Table of contents always helps. Never hurt anyone, especially if it's a long document.
I think the only thing I want to mention is that if you are interested in writing and you are, watching this lecture and going, wow, how does that work? Can I do that? Can I make that happen? Just come over to the writing channel and ask questions there. We have a great welcome document, which was actually just linked in the lecture hall chat. And you can start getting into it, and we will give you feedback on all of these things. But referencing back to this lecture will help you as you get started. So if you have not started game writing yet, or if you are already a student and you're building your portfolio and getting more and more confident in your writing, just spend as much time as you can actually writing, and just like anything else, you will improve at it. So we don't bite. Please come join writing and see what you can do. I would ask, is there anyone who has any questions for just me or Nitwit as writing teachers, or just any of those people? We have several alums listening in right now who and people working on projects who could maybe answer a question about working on the projects, if anybody has any questions like that.
Hi, I'm actually from Fallout London. I'm the project lead from that, so it's not a Skyrim thing, but obviously we work much under the same pretense, with like how writers and implementators all work together. One thing I would say is never be afraid to, it was said before, but never be afraid to actually reach out to those implementation people, because there's nothing worse than you writing down this most amazing thing. If it's not technically possible, you could actually just speak to someone that's on the level design team or implementation team, and they can just give you that answer right there and then, or look into it, or vice versa. It's better to be able to try and get your point across when you speak to a level designer if they are building it and in the process of doing it, rather than when it's fully done. Because sure, they can make tweaks afterwards, but it's better to catch it there and then rather than right at the end. That's just something that we do on our end. But yeah, I definitely think that to speak between people while they're in the process of making things is a lot better than once it's done. But yeah, just speak to your departments. Don't just whittle yourself away into your writing. Just always go out and ask questions, speak to it, and find out what's possible. I just think that's very important.
Hey.
Okay. Outside of like just not being in a headspace to go ahead and ask, what are some of the most common communication pitfalls or bottlenecks that you personally have come across?
There's always, you're always going to run the risk, especially if you're working on a partner project, of not knowing what's available to you. or what's available to elevate your quest writing or your NPC writing, because so much of our partner projects, they work on developing new assets, new weapons, new landscaping elements, new clothing, things like that. So I think a lot of the common pitfalls that we might have would be, hey, do we have this? No, we don't. Or, hey, do we have this? Actually, yes, we do. Or, hey, is this possible for, can we maybe create this that would, totally alter the project of the game? Or can we do this that would, have very little impact on the rest of the game? So a lot of those kind of communication errors, I guess you would call them, come from, not knowing what the other departments are up to.
So something like a centralized design document or just a sort of private wiki of sorts might help with that.
Definitely. I know some projects do have internalized onboarding documents, and that those documents can vary per department, but even just hanging out with your fellow level designers or implementers in a general chat, and maybe just talking to them about how this thing works on their end, that can help you get kind of a feel for what their challenges are or what's easy for them to do, that sort of thing. And that way you can kind of work that into your writing.
Right. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. This was my first lecture, so I hope I managed to break some ground in the writing development.